So good morning to all. First, I would like to thank the Bisocial team for the invitation. I'm a bit sorry not to be in Brussels today, although. I will start. I like to present a bit myself before starting the talk. I'm a historian initially trained in political sciences and international history, which is not exactly what we are going to speak about today. What I'm going to talk about today is linked a bit to chance. I have started collecting tweets in 2009, so 13 years ago now, for a conference I was organizing in Luxembourg, and just to know what the conference participants were discussing on Twitter during the conference. I then learned, first for subjects of personal interest, to collect tweets massively thanks to the streaming API. I will explain what is an API and what is the streaming API of Twitter a bit later. And so when the centenary of the First World War started, I was ready to collect tweets massively, easily, and I did it first to see what would happen. And I did it after some discussions with historians of the Great War. And it worked so well that it became my main research project until 2019, for 5 years. And in March 2020, when the first lockdowns were initiated in Europe, I had my server ready as the centenary of the First World War on Twitter project had reached an end for a few months. So I started collecting tweets. That's still underway. I'm still collecting tweets about the pandemics, with today more than 62 million tweets, mostly French-speaking, stored somewhere in a database on a university, on the University of Luxembourg server. So that's the two projects I will base my keynote on today. So API or archives, tormented ways to transform tweets into historical sources. Defining an application programming interface, so the API, is far easier than defining archives. So I will start by defining what is an API. An API is a socio-technical device, a piece of software in this case, that allows two apps to exchange features, for instance. If you see on the web page, a Facebook like button, that's a use of the Facebook API. But it's also about exchanging information, and concerning what we are discussing today, I am, like many developers and researchers, using the Twitter API to get information. Concretely, a piece of software on a server at the University of Luxembourg is connecting to the Twitter API, sends to this API some information, basically what I want to collect. So all tweets containing a word or a hashtag taken from a list of words or hashtags. And then the Twitter API is returning, if the request meets some conditions that are defined by Twitter, the Twitter API is returning information, in this case, tweets and metadata about those tweets and their authors. So archives is much more complex to define. I need to precise here that I am a historian and speaking as such, so my considerations on archives might be contested by archivists who are far more rigorous than historians usually. So archives is a word and concept that is much more polysemic than API. All the more that the first digital humanities projects were often called archives, for instance, the William Blake archives, and in a way blurred the definition of archives. Furthermore, even if most European languages are using more or less the same word or the same roots, the French archive, the English archive, the German archive or archivalian, to give some examples, they don't cover the same concepts. And even when they do, traditions to concretely collect sort archives are not the same from one country to the other. And I should precise here again that even if I'm speaking in English, my concept of archives when I use the English word might be more the French concept of archive. So as it is complex to define, I asked the system that simplifies everything to define the concept of archives, and this system is, of course, Google. Here you see the definition of archives from Google, so in English. And some elements here are quite important, but they could all be defined better: collection, historical documents, records, store. But this definition lacks something. And this something is present in the definition in French. Like you ask Google to define archive in French. And here the important word is classé, that means sorted. It's an important point because behind this word lays most of the work of archivists and librarians. Archivists have to decide what will be collected, what will be kept, how it will be sorted, and where it will be stored. And then they index documents that are stored in Archive Center. And archiving is basically the setting of historians' work. We remain still here in a too simple definition of archives, but let's say that the archivist and librarian's work can be summed up in 3 words: preserving, sorting, indexing. I let aside storage for today, and I'll speak about access a bit later. Those 3 words are basically the setting, defining the setting of historians' work. With no preservation, there's no history. If documents or records are not sorted, they are not findable, and there's no academic history possible. If they are not indexed, searching the right document might still be too hard, and then history and academic history is biased. Just one example taken from my previous researcher's life when I did my PhDs, more or less 20 years ago. When I first went to the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, I had to look for archives, documents, that for some of them used to be stored in the former West Germany, in Koblenz, and some in the former East Germany in Potsdam. In Koblenz, they worked on indexing. I could do very efficient search, sometimes at the level of the documents rather than at the level of the box. Archives that used to be stored in East Germany were preserved, sorted, but not indexed. I had to work very differently, less efficiently, and I worked so much slower. So archiving is the basis of almost all work of history. Archives are mediated thanks to the archivist work, and that's the important point. But there's a difference between archives and primary sources. All archives are primary sources, at least potentially, but all primary sources are not necessarily archives. Indeed, in some cases, historians have to get their primary sources without archivists. For instance, oral history often implies a method where the historian is creating, together with the interviewees, their own primary sources. Some private archives, even if we call them private archives, so family archives, for instance, can sometimes be included in primary sources, but not in archives when they are preserved, but not sorted and even less indexed. In that case, historians will have to sort and index archives themselves, and that can be a complex process. Tweets, finally getting there, data from social media, so I am saying data and not archives, you will notice it, but I'm not going to speak about that today, but it's an important element. Tweets, data from social media can also be primary sources, of course, but most of them are not archives in the sense that they are not the subject of the works of archivists. Preservation, sorting, indexing are dealt differently in the case of tweets and social media archives and social media data, at least for now. Either they are archived through processes such as web archiving, but very few of them are, or they are not archived at all. They will be preserved or not by social media firms themselves. And you will have access to them through either possibly not really legal ways, basically scrapping, or through an API. And if there is an API, which is not always the case. So to access tweets, there is a mediation to access them through the API, not through the works of archivists, or at least for now. So tweets are primary sources. Twitter has an API, and it's relatively open. That's why we are all working on Twitter. It's easy to collect. Facebook API is much more restricted, for instance, and some services like WhatsApp have no API, or at least no API that allows to collect data, even for research. In the case of WhatsApp, of course, it's not at all a bad thing. It bothers me a bit, but it's not a bad thing. So using the Twitter API is a convenient way to get primary sources about events, phenomenon, information, contemporary phenomenon, information circulation since 2006. So since the creation of Twitter, but it's not archived in the proper sense. There's no archivist work of selection, preservation, sorting, and indexing, but at the Library of Congress, but I will speak about that a bit later as a conclusion. So instead of having the archives and the archivist work as setting of the historian's work, we have an API. The mediation between historians and their primary sources is here totally different than in Archive Center. This API is changing over time, sometimes dramatically. Think about Facebook that closed many features of its API in 2016, for instance. This API is forcing you to make choices. You want to use the Stream API, I will explain what it is, or the Search API, that's a big question. Do you have a budget to pay to access the full API, so the full history of Twitter? Or since 2021, you can be validated by Twitter as a researcher, but still that has some other constraints and forces to make some other choices. And this API is giving you the opportunity, but although the responsibility to create your own primary sources, your own corpus, your own data sets. So more generally, when you work with social media or lots of web-based, internet accessible online services, when you work with social media and their APIs, there are many elements you should pay attention to. Is there an API? Sometimes there's no API. As I said, we are many to work on Twitter because it's feasible, because there's an API. It's a strong source of biases. What happens on Twitter is not necessarily cannot necessarily be generalized to other social media. Of course, there are other ways, scrapping, but it's not necessarily legal. And in some cases, there will be enough data or primary sources from social media in web archives, such as the Wayback Machine or National Library's web archives. Another element you should pay attention to is what are the conditions to use the API. Before 2021, to use Twitter's API with no budget, you had to choose between streaming and search. Streaming means that you can get up to 1% of the firehose, so 1% of the tweets that are published at one precise time, in real time. That meant 5 to 6 million tweets per day, theoretically. But that implies to anticipate hashtags, for instance, to anticipate what's going to happen on Twitter, and that's not easy. The other way to collect data on Twitter before 2021 was the Search API, but with very strong limitations. You could only go back up to 7 days in the past. That's the strongest limitation of the former Search API. Then another element you should pay attention to, it's the sustainability of the API. It's not sustainable, basically. It will change and it might be brutally closed, and that will destroy at the same time your research project. It happened to the French project Algopol that was studying the relation to privacy on social media by French citizens, because 2016, Facebook closed the API that they were using, hopefully for AlgoPol. They had enough data to work on, and they could go do their research up to the end. Another example of change is what Marta Severos discovered. For instance, when you collect a tweet, you will have geolocalization information, but the way the geolocalization is conceptualized by Twitter change over time. It's not always the same place that you will have in your metadata. All those elements will orient your research and influence the way you work. The disadvantage is that the work archivists are usually doing with lots of historical documents will be used to do. It's time consuming. It also requires to learn technical skills and not only computing skills, also some skills that are usually in the domain of the archivist. The advantage is that you can tailor your corpus as you wish, and you can do so very explicitly. So in terms of method, it can be a bit better. So good research, or at least I hope so, is possible with tweets as primary sources. I will here speak about two research projects that I already evoked, based on massive corpora of tweets, the WW1 project and the COVID project. Of course, my method is here mainly quantitative, sometimes qualitative. Some research, of course, can be purely qualitative or quantitative. It's not at all exclusive. The interest of those two projects for today, that the first one was entirely based on the Twitter API version 1.1, the former one, and the streaming sets of command. And the second one is based on the same API, at least at the beginning, and now on the new Twitter API version 2. So with an access to 10 million tweets per month, if you are recognized by Twitter as a researcher, which I am. For the WW1 and the echoes of the centenary of the First World War online project, I have started to collect tweets about the centenary of the First World War in April 2014, before the commemoration started. And I've stopped this harvesting in December 2019 to have 1/11 of November after the end of the centenary in my database. I collected a bit more than 9 million tweets, published by around 1.5 million Twitter accounts. It can look quite a lot, but it's not necessarily a lot. Around 2/3 are retweets. I have used hashtags or keywords to collect those tweets, mostly in French and English. 85% of the tweets are in English, 10% are in French, and the 5 remaining gather other languages. I have tried to explore this corpus with distant reading tools. So distant reading is usually a reference to Franco Moretti's book entitled Graphs, Maps, and Trees, published in 2007. It is a set of distant reading is a set of quantitative methods that allows a researcher to ask the computer to read for them when there is too much data to be read humanly. Since 2007, most researchers are integrating distant reading in scalable reading, where distant reading and close reading are used at the same time. Distant reading might be necessary as tweets are, when you use tweets are primary sources, and when they are massively collected, when basically you're doing some sort of big data. But when they are massively collected, they are primary sources that you cannot read yourself. So close reading and other kinds of readings might be necessary to get to the details, but you first need to do some distant reading just to know what's in your database. I have used the Twitter streaming API, such as available in its 1.1 version, and that's implied constraints. The first constraint is this 1% of the fire hose. So the fire hose, it's the access to all tweets being published at one moment. 1% of the fire hose means technically 5 to 6 million a day, but the 1% is based on quarters of hours. So I did, particularly on the 11th of November 2018, sometimes go over the 1%, which means that some tweets have not been collected on those occasions. Another constraint is anticipation. At the beginning of the research project in 2014, I could not guess that the 2016 commemoration of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July 2016 would use the Somme 100 hashtag. It's quite logical as a hashtag, but you cannot anticipate it. And a third constraint is that no past tweets are available. Errors in anticipation can hardly be corrected. One example, in the WW1 project, it's the assassination of Jean Jaurès. In fact, it's not present in my database for several reasons, and I could do today, but with the API v2, but at that time, I could not repair this error, this missingness. We should also remember that sometimes there's no efficient ways to collect tweets for one event. It's still in the case of this research project, the case of the centenary of the First Battle of the Marne, for instance, because no obvious hashtag or keywords could be collected. Just some results, but I'm a bit late, so it will be quite fast. Here you've got data visualization of the French-speaking part of the database. What you see, it's basically clusters of tweets. The words you see are the words that are the most representative of one of those keywords, of one of those cluster of tweets. So cluster of tweets are calculated based on co-occurrence of words and collocation of words. Basically, from that kind of visualization, I can see the main topics that are discussed in my database. And what is great is that I can project those clusters through times. And for instance, in this data visualization that I understand is not easy to read if you don't know how to read, I can, for instance, say that for the whole centenary, people were paying homage to fallen soldiers, but not with the same words during formal commemorations in comparison to the rest of the years. For instance, during formal commemoration, they are paying homage to fallen soldiers with very general words, and the rest of the year it will be with more precise words related to precise fallen soldier. So you see the first names, where they died, at which date. Of course, I can also do some network visualization, but I'm a bit late, so I will not comment this one. So then the second research project, the COVID-19 on Twitter project, I will not detail too much the results because basically it's not over. I have started to collect tweets while obvious that France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and other European countries would be placed under lockdown. So around 1 week after Italy was placed under lockdown, so mid-March 2020. It's still going on for now with the API version 1.1, so with the streaming API. So it's for now 62 million of tweets. I'm doing that with my colleague today at the University of Modena, Deborah Pacci. And we have also an Italian corpus for comparison. For instance, one happened on Twitter during lockdowns in French-speaking countries, mostly French, and in Italy, and we can compare that, we try to. The interesting thing is that during this research project, a new API version of the API of Twitter was released. In the midterm, it will replace the former one. And we have learned to use this API since 2021, and this new API is a huge innovation for researchers. If you are recognized as researcher by Twitter, then you can collect up to 10 million tweets a month in the full history of Twitter. That's new, and you can do it legally. It's very addictive, to be honest, and that's a sort of long-term point of view brought to Twitter research, long-term from a social media point of view, of course, we're not here in the longue durée. It's still not archives or archiving, but it starts to be a bit better than the previous API, and it's streaming set of comments because you have a right to make a mistake in the API version 2. But there are new limitations. There's a price to that. There are tweets that you will not be able to collect, deleted tweets, tweets from account that switch to private status, for instance, that makes the search archive feature in the V2 version of the API a problem if you want to study some kind of research questions like controversies or the spread of misinformation. There is another limitation which is the process that allows you to get recognized by Twitter as a researcher. What if you're rejected? It happened to Nick Ruest, who is quite well known in the web archiving community. His demand was rejected by Twitter, and probably because he mentioned web archiving, but it's a guess. So what would be, considering what I just developed, what would be a proper archives of tweets, and would it be a better solution, also a proper archiving of tweets? For lots of research question, it would be probably a best solution than using the API. It would be also a strong gain of time, to be honest. But the problem is rather to define what would be a proper archiving of tweets, and that's what Speech Social is about in the end. What would be the point from the researcher point of view? Just some thoughts. I am working with CSV, JSONs, SQL or NoSQL databases. So in the metadata that I get with the API, there are elements about the pieces of software users have used to consult Twitter, so I can imagine what was the interface they used, but I can only imagine, it's not really precise. There are lots of metadata when you collect tweets, and there is something here that I lack when I collect tweets myself. It's the historicization of the tweets. Just an example to explain that. Let's take an example of a tweet that has long been the most favorited, retweeted tweet of Twitter's history. It's the Barack Obama's 4 more years tweets in 2012. If you look at it today, Twitter's interface, Obama's picture, answers, retweets are elements of today. If you collect it with the API today, you will have some elements that historicize it, its publication dates, and some that are today's elements. So retweets, favorites, and most of the metadata about the account who published it. Tweets metadata are not time consistent when you use the API, in the sense that there is no concept of history in its metadata. And this would be hard to implement on the side of Twitter anyway. Of course, in this case, because it's a very famous tweet, you can have a look at how it looked in 2012, because there is the Wayback Machine, there is Internet Archive. But in most cases, I would say 99% of the tweets ever published, probably 99.9% of those tweets, it's just not possible. It's not been archived by the Wayback Machine. Furthermore, even if it was, it's not that simple to collect archived tweets massively within the Wayback Machine. I think it's even impossible. So using tweets archived in web archives today is hence probably limited to qualitative method, which is fine, but it's not the same research question you will answer than if you use quantitative methods. And so we are here at the heart of what could bring to researcher a proper archiving of tweets, historicization of tweets, and although the possibility to use several kinds of methods. So at the conclusion, how to really historicize Twitter? I'll let here the social team in a way answer this question. For me, the ideal situation is to have at the same time the API and archives and proper archives of tweets. So the best of two worlds. But archivists and librarians have choices to make, decisions to take, because they have no infinite means to archive. And it's not always possible to have the best of the two worlds. The Twitter archive at the Library of Congress is a good example of the choices archivists and librarians may have to do in the case of an archiving of tweets. So an agreement between Twitter and the Library of Congress allows the latter to archive Twitter. Up to the end of 2017, this archiving was integral. All tweets from 2006 until December 2017 are stored at the Library of Congress. But the Library of Congress lacks the technology to search its Twitter archive, so it's not accessible at all. So from the 1st of January 2018, the Library of Congress started to archive Twitter on a selective basis. It's been depicted sometimes as a failure, but archivists know in the end that they must do choices, even if it bothers historians. And clearly, I would have preferred a full archiving of all tweets and, if possible, accessible. But archiving everything bears also a risk in itself, which is basically losing everything. If you, for instance, don't have the budget to archive everything, but try to archive everything, you might just lose everything. In the case of the Twitter archive at the Library of Congress, it means that it is not accessible yet. They just don't have the technical skills to allow you to do a search to find even one single tweet. And this question, in the end, the question of the choice, the decisions you need to have to make to set up a proper archives, whether of tweets or any other kind of documents, is an old question asked to archivists, librarians, and historians. And I thank you for your attention.